The weight of wealth can crush more than poverty ever could. When billionaire Garrett Miles discovers his young son forming an unexpected bond with the night janitor in his corporate tower, a single interrupted bedtime story becomes the catalyst for a reckoning that will shatter everything he thought he knew about success, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be rich. In the sterile halls of power, where emotional connection is the rarest commodity of all, sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. What begins as a simple act of kindness between strangers becomes a mirror reflecting the hollow spaces in a life built on everything except what matters most. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The 47th floor of the Miles Technologies building held that particular silence that comes with money, thick, insulated, and somehow colder than regular quiet. Garrett Miles's corner office commanded a view of the city that most people would kill for, but at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, even the lights below seemed tired. He should have been home hours ago. The thought flickered through his mind like a dying bulb as he signed another contract, the Mont Blanc pen scratching against paper, in a rhythm that had become his heartbeat: acquire, expand, profit. The holy trinity that had built his empire from nothing, that had pulled him from the cramped apartment in Chinatown where his mother had worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. His phone buzzed. A text from Elena, his ex-wife. "Ethan asking where you are again. Told him you're working, as usual." Garrett set the phone face down without responding. Elena had mastered the art of guilt in 22 words or less. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Carmen Rodriguez, one of the night cleaning crew. Mid-50s, graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the standard-issue uniform that somehow looked dignified on her small frame. She carried herself with a quiet authority that Garrett had noticed before, the way she moved through the building like she belonged here, not like she was just passing through. "Mr. Miles," she said, her accent carrying the musical cadence of someone who had learned English as a gift to herself, not an obligation. "I didn't know you were still here." "I can come back later." "No, it's fine. I'll be a while anyway." She nodded and began her routine, emptying the wastebasket, wiping down surfaces with methodical precision. Garrett tried to return to his work, but something was different tonight. There was a tension in Carmen's movements, a distraction in the way she kept glancing toward the door. "Everything all right?" he found himself asking. Carmen paused, her cloth suspended over his desk. "My grandson," she said finally. "He's in the office downstairs. His mother, me daughter, she works the late shift at the hospital. No one else to watch him tonight." Garrett looked up from his papers. "How old?" "7. 7. Ethan's age." "That's—" Garrett started, then stopped. What was he going to say? That it was against building policy? That children weren't supposed to be here after hours? The words felt like stones in his mouth. "He's very quiet," Carmen added quickly. "He brings his books. He knows not to touch anything." Something in her voice apparent, protecting a child, the fierce tenderness that Garrett recognized but couldn't remember feeling, made him nod. "Of course. I understand." Carmen's shoulders relaxed, almost imperceptibly. "Thank you, Mr. Miles." She finished cleaning and left, but the weight of the conversation lingered. Garrett tried to focus on the quarterly projections spread across his desk, but his mind kept drifting to a 7-year-old boy somewhere in the building below, waiting for his grandmother to finish work. 20 minutes later, he gave up pretending to concentrate. The elevator descended in that smooth, expensive silence, carrying him down to the floor where the cleaning supplies were stored, where Carmen would be working through the maze of cubicles. He wasn't sure what drew him there: curiosity, maybe, or something more complicated that he didn't want to examine too closely. He found them in a break room on the 32nd floor. The scene stopped him in the doorway. Carmen sat in one of the plastic chairs, her back straight despite the long day. Beside her, a small boy was curled against her arm, his dark hair catching the fluorescent light. In Carmen's hands was a worn paperback book, and her voice, soft and warm, filled the sterile space with something that felt like home. "Where the wild things are," she read, her accent turning the familiar words into something new, something more beautiful. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. The boy Miguel, Garrett remembered, now listened with the complete attention that only children possess. His eyes were heavy with sleep, but he fought it, unwilling to miss a single word. Garrett should have left. Should have returned to his office, to his contracts and projections, and the comfortable distance of the 47th floor. Instead, he found himself stepping into the room. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Carmen looked up, startled. Miguel's eyes went wide, suddenly alert. He straightened, moving slightly away from his grandmother, as if proximity to her might get them both in trouble. "Mr. Miles," Carmen began, but Garrett held up a hand. "Please, don't stop. I was just—" He paused, searching for words that didn't sound patronizing or invasive. "I remember that book." Miguel studied him with the frank assessment of childhood. "Do you have kids?" he asked. "Miguel," Carmen said softly, a gentle warning. "It's okay," Garrett said. "Yes, I have a son. About your age. Does he like stories?" The question hit Garrett like a physical blow. When was the last time he had read to Ethan? When was the last time they had sat together like this, sharing something quiet and good? Yes, I think he does." Carmen was watching him carefully, her dark eyes seeing more than he was comfortable with. There was no judgment there, no accusation, just a kind of recognition that made his chest tight. "Would you like to sit?" she asked. Garrett looked at the empty chairs around the small table, at Miguel's expectant face, at Carmen's patient expression. Every instinct told him to make his excuses and leave. He had emails to answer, calls to return to Tokyo, a presentation to review for the morning board meeting. Instead, he sat down. Carmen continued reading, her voice weaving the familiar story into something new. Miguel relaxed again, leaning into his grandmother's warmth, but his eyes kept drifting to Garrett with curious interest. "And it was still hot," Carmen read. Approaching the end of the story, Garrett found himself anticipating the words, remembering the weight of his own son on his lap, the smell of Ethan's hair, the way small fingers would trace the illustrations. When had that stopped? When had bedtime stories become Elena's responsibility, then the nanny's, then something that happened without him entirely? And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Carmen repeated the crucial line, her voice soft. Something cracked inside Garrett's chest. The story ended in the gentle way of good children's books, with comfort and belonging and the promise of soup still warm. Miguel sighed contentedly, then looked at Garrett with sleepy eyes. "My abuela tells the best stories," he said. "I can see that," Garrett replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Carmen closed the book, her fingers tracing the cover. "Stories are important," she said simply. "They're how we remember who we are, how we teach love." The words hung in the fluorescent air like a question Garrett didn't know how to answer. Miguel yawned widely, then seemed to remember where he was. He straightened again, suddenly formal. "Thank you for letting me stay, Mr. Miles. I promise I won't touch anything or make noise." The careful politeness in the child's voice, the way he had already learned to make himself small and grateful in the presence of power, made Garrett feel sick. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "And you don't have to promise anything. You belong here." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Carmen. She tilted her head, studying his face with that quiet intensity again. "My shift ends at midnight," she said. "Miguel's mother picks him up then." Garrett checked his watch. 11:50. In 10 minutes, they would leave, and he would return to his office, to his contracts, and his empty success. The thought felt unbearable. "Carmen," he said, then stopped. What was he going to say? That watching her read to her grandson had reminded him of everything he had lost? That in 20 minutes, She had shown him more love than he had given his own son in months? Yes, Mr. Miles? Would Miguel like to see the view from my office? Miguel's eyes lit up, but he looked to his grandmother for permission. Carmen hesitated, her expression careful. If it's not too much trouble, she said finally. No trouble at all. They rode the elevator up in comfortable silence, Miguel pressing his nose to the glass as the floors flashed by. When the doors opened on the 47th floor, he gasped. Wow. Garrett's office, which he had occupied for 3 years, suddenly looked different through a child's eyes. The massive windows, the view that stretched to the horizon, the leather furniture and gleaming surface it was impressive certainly, but it was also cold. Empty. Miguel ran to the windows, pressing his palms against the glass. You can see everything from here, he breathed. Yes, Garrett said. Everything. But even as he said it, he realized it wasn't true. From up here, you couldn't see the break room on the 32nd floor, where a grandmother read stories to her grandson. You couldn't see the love in Carmen's voice, or the trust in Miguel's sleepy eyes. You couldn't see the things that mattered. Carmen stood beside him, also looking out at the city. It's beautiful, she said, but it must be lonely sometimes. The observation was gentle, without malice, but it cut deeper than any criticism could have. Yes, Garrett said quietly, it is. Miguel turned from the window, his attention caught by the framed photo on Garrett's desk, the only personal item in the entire office. It showed Garrett and Ethan at the beach last summer, both squinting into the sun, Ethan's small hand in his father's. Is that your son? Miguel asked. Yes. His name is Ethan. He looks nice. Does he like wild things too? Garrett stared at the photo, at his son's gap-toothed smile, at his own expression, which looked strained even in a moment of supposed happiness. When was the last time he had really looked at this picture? When was the last time he had really looked at Ethan? I don't know, he admitted. The honesty of it hit him like a physical blow. He didn't know what stories his son liked, what made him laugh, what he dreamed about at night. He didn't know his own child. Carmen was watching him again with that gentle, seeing expression. In the fluorescent light of the break room, her face had looked tired, worn by years of hard work and responsibility. But here, in the soft glow of his office lamps, he could see the strength in her features, the intelligence in her eyes, the deep well of love that sustained her. It's not too late, she said simply. Before Garrett could respond, his phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. At the lobby. Here for Miguel. Carmen checked her own phone and nodded. His mother, she explained. We should go. They rode down together, the elevator carrying them from Garrett's rarefied world back to the ground level where real life waited. In the lobby, a young woman in scrub-stired but smiling waited for them. She embraced Miguel with the fierce love of a mother who had been apart from her child for too long. Thank you, Mama, she said to Carmen, then noticed Garrett. Her expression grew wary, protective. This is Mr. Miles, Carmen explained. He was kind enough to let Miguel see his office. The young woman Sophia, Garrett remembered from the employee records, relaxed slightly. Thank you, she said simply. They left together, grandmother, mother, and child, their voices fading as they walked toward the parking garage. Garrett stood in his lobby, surrounded by marble and glass, and the weight of his own success, watching them disappear. The building felt different after they were gone, emptier. Not just quiet now, but hollow. He took the elevator back to his office, but instead of returning to his desk, he found himself at the window, looking down at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Carmen was probably tucking Miguel into bed, maybe reading him one more story. Somewhere else, Ethan was asleep in a house that Garrett paid for but rarely visited, in a bed where his father never read him stories anymore. Garrett picked up his phone and started to dial Elena's number, then stopped. It was nearly 1 a.m. Ethan would be asleep. What would he say anyway? That he had remembered something important tonight, something he had lost without even noticing? Instead, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a business card he hadn't looked at in months. Dr. Sarah Martinez, family therapist. Elena had suggested they try counseling before the divorce was finalized. Garrett had been too busy, too important, too convinced that their problems were temporary inconveniences that success would eventually solve. He set the card on his desk next to the photo of Ethan, then sat back in his chair. The contracts and projections that had seemed so urgent an hour ago now looked like what they were: paper. Important paper, certainly, but not more important than a 7-year-old boy who still believed his father might come home for bedtime stories. Garrett Miles, who had built an empire by never questioning his priorities, spent the rest of the night questioning everything. Garrett didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office until dawn, watching the city wake up through his windows first, the delivery trucks, then the early commuters, then the full rush of another day beginning. At some point, he had moved the family photo closer to his keyboard, and now Ethan's face seemed to watch him with patient expectation. At 7 a.m., his assistant Janitor arrived, her heels clicking efficiently across the marble floor. She paused in his doorway, taking in his rumpled shirt and day-old stubble with barely concealed alarm. "Mr. Miles, did you sleep here?" "Cancel my morning meetings," he said without looking up from the photo. "Sir?" "All of them. The board presentation, the call with Singapore, everything." Jennifer's expression shifted from alarm to barely controlled panic. "Sir, the board meeting is crucial. The Henderson acquisition will survive one day without me." Garrett finally looked at her, seeing his own exhaustion reflected in her worried face. "Jennifer, do you have children?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "2 daughters, sir." "What time do they wake up?" "Around 7, but I don't see—" "Go home," Garrett said. "Take them to school yourself today." "Mr. Miles, I can't just—" "You can, you should." He stood, his body protesting after the long night in his chair. "I'm going home too." The drive to Elena's house, his former house, really, though the divorce papers had signed away his claim to it, took 40 minutes through morning traffic. He hadn't made this drive during school hours in over a year. The familiar streets looked different in daylight, softer somehow, full of children walking to school and parents in bathrobes retrieving newspapers. Elena answered the door in her yoga clothes, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked younger in the morning light, more like the woman he had married 12 years ago, before success had started consuming him in careful increments. "Garrett?" She checked her watch, frowning. "Is everything okay? You never come by this early." "Is Ethan still here?" "He's finishing breakfast." "Garrett, what's going on?" He could hear his son's voice from the kit Miles, chattering to someone, probably Maria, the housekeeper who had become more of a parent to Ethan than Garrett had ever been. The realization sat heavy in his chest. "I want to take him to school," Garrett said. Elena's frown deepened. "Take him to school?" "Yes. But Maria always—" "I know." Garrett looked past her toward the kit Miles, where Ethan's voice was explaining something elaborate about dinosaurs to a patient adult. "I want to do it today." Elena studied his face with the sharp attention of someone who had once loved him, who still knew how to read the signs of his distress. "Garrett, you look terrible. Are you having some kind of breakdown?" The question should have insulted him. Instead, it felt like relief to have someone notice. "Maybe," he said honestly. Something in his voice made her step back, gesturing him inside. The house smelled like coffee and toast and childhood, a combination that hit him like a memory he hadn't known he was carrying. "Daddy?" Ethan appeared in the kit Miles' doorway, his backpack already on, his face bright with surprise. At 7, he still believed in the magic of unexpected moments, in the possibility that ordinary Tuesdays could turn extraordinary without warning. "Hey, buddy." Garrett knelt to his son's level, struck by how much Ethan had grown since he had really looked at him. "I thought maybe I could drive you to school today." Ethan's eyes went wide. "Really? But don't you have work?" The innocence in the question, the way Ethan accepted that work always came first, that his father's presence was something to be surprised by rather than expected, nearly broke Garrett's composure. "Work can wait," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Elena was watching them both with careful attention, her arms crossed. "Ethan, go brush your teeth again." I want to talk to your father." Ethan bounded up the stairs with the energy of childhood, leaving them alone in the entryway. Elena waited until his footsteps faded, then turned to Garrett with the direct gaze he remembered from their early arguments. "What happened last night?" Garrett considered lying, or deflecting, or giving her one of the smooth half-truths that had become his default in difficult conversations. Instead, he found himself telling her about Carmen and Miguel, about the story in the break room, about the hollow feeling in his chest when he watched them leave. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from suspicion to something softer, more complicated. "Do you remember," she said when he finished, "when Ethan was 4, and he used to make up stories about the monsters under his bed?" Garrett shook his head. "You would sit with him every night for 2 weeks, helping him negotiate with them. You told him that monsters were just feelings that didn't know how to be small yet." Elena's voice was quiet, remembering. He loved those talks. He felt so brave afterward. The memory was there, just at the edge of Garrett's consciousness, Ethan's small hand in his, the serious discussions about monster diplomacy, the way his son's breathing would slow as fear transformed into security. "When did I stop doing that?" Garrett asked. "When the company started expanding internationally. When the late nights became every night. When you started believing that providing for him was the same as being there for him." The words weren't cruel, just accurate, which somehow made them worse. "Daddy," Ethan's voice called from upstairs. "My backpack is really heavy today because I have library books." "Coming," Garrett called back, then looked at Elena. "Will you let me take him?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "You can't do this once and disappear again," she said finally. "He's not a toy you can pick up when you're feeling guilty." "I know. Do you? Because that's what you did with us, Garrett. You'd have these moments of clarity, these grand gestures, and then the demands of the business would swallow you up again. I won't let you break his heart the way you broke mine." The accusation hung between them, true and painful. Garrett wanted to defend himself, to explain about the pressure and the responsibility and the weight of building something from nothing. Instead, he thought about Miguel's sleepy trust, Carmen's gentle wisdom, the way love looked when it was practiced daily instead of displayed occasionally. "I'm going to therapy," he said. Elena blinked, clearly not expecting that. "What?" "Dr. Martinez, the one you wanted us to see before. I found her card last night." "Garrett, I know it might be too late for us, but maybe it's not too late for him." He looked toward the stairs where Ethan was now singing some complicated song about space exploration. "I want to learn how to be his father, really be it, not just pay for it." Elena's expression softened despite herself. "It's not about money, Garrett. It never was. I'm starting to understand that." Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his backpack comically large on his small frame. "I'm ready. And I remembered to bring the permission slip for the field trip." "What field trip?" Garrett asked as Ethan clattered down the stairs. "The Children's Museum. We're going to see the dinosaur exhibit and learn about fossils and maybe see a real meteorite." Ethan's words tumbled over each other in his excitement. "Mom signed the form, but I have to give it to Mrs. Patterson today, or I can't go." Garrett looked at the crumpled paper his son thrust toward him, seeing his ex-wife's careful signature, the emergency contact information that listed only Elena's number. When had he become so peripheral to his son's life that school forms didn't even include his information? "That sounds amazing," Garrett said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "Tell me about dinosaurs on the way to school." The drive to Ethan's elementary school took 15 minutes that felt like stepping into a different universe. Ethan chattered from the back seat about T-Rex versus Triceratops, about how fossils were made, about his friend Jake, who had a rock collection and maybe knew everything about geology. Garrett found himself really listening, not the distracted half-attention he usually gave to Ethan's monologues, but genuine engagement with his son's enthusiastic expertise. When had Ethan become so knowledgeable about science? When had he developed this passion for discovery that reminded Garrett of his own childhood fascination with how things worked? "Dad," Ethan said as they pulled into the school parking lot, How come you never take me to school?" The question was matter of fact, without accusation, which somehow made it harder to answer. "I've been working too much," Garrett said honestly. "But I want to change that." "Okay." Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt with the easy acceptance of childhood. "Maybe tomorrow you could take me again? And I could tell you about what we learn at the museum?" "I'd like that very much." Garrett walked Ethan to his classroom, feeling oddly out of place among the other parents, mostly mothers, he noticed, with a few fathers who looked more comfortable navigating this world of small desks and alphabet charts. Mrs. Howder-Dacian 6. Patterson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers, looked surprised to see him. "Mr. Miles, how nice to meet you finally. Ethan talks about you all the time." The comment hit him unexpectedly. "He does?" "Oh yes, he's very proud of your work. He told the whole class that his dad builds things that help people talk to each other all over the world." Garrett looked down at Ethan, who was carefully hanging his backpack on his assigned hook. In his son's simple explanation, the corporate empire that consumed Garrett's life became something noble, something worth being proud of. The child's perspective was both humbling and devastating. "Mr. Miles," Mrs. Patterson continued, "I was wondering if you might be interested in our career day next month. We're always looking for parents to share what they do." Garrett glanced at Ethan, who was now looking at him with hopeful eyes. "Yes, I'd like that." "Wonderful. I'll send the information home with Ethan." The bell rang, and children began settling into their seats. Ethan hugged Garrett goodbye, a quick, unself-conscious embrace that reminded Garrett of everything he had been missing. "See you later, Dad." "See you later, buddy." Garrett stood in the hallway for a moment after the classroom door closed, listening to Mrs. Patterson begin the day's lesson. Through the small window, he could see Ethan at his desk, already absorbed in whatever activity was beginning. His son looked happy, engaged, surrounded by friends and learning, and all the small rituals that made up a child's world, a world that Garrett had been absent from, choosing board meetings over bedtime stories, international calls over school plays, the pursuit of more over the appreciation of enough. Walking back to his car, Garrett passed the school library. Through the windows, he could see shelves of children's books, including a display of Maurice Sendak that featured "Where the Wild Things Are" prominently. He thought of Carmen's voice reading those familiar words, of Miguel's sleepy attention, of the way stories could create connection across any distance. He pulled out his phone and called Dr. Martinez's office. "I'd like to schedule an appointment," he told the receptionist, "as soon as possible. Individual or couples therapy." Garrett looked back at the school, where his son was learning about dinosaurs and friendship and the million small things that happened in a life when someone was paying attention. "Individual first," he said. "But I hope it leads to family therapy eventually. We have an opening this afternoon at 3. "I'll take it." The drive back to the office felt different than it had that morning. The city looked the same, but Garrett found himself noticing things he had never seen before: the small parks where parents pushed children on swings, the coffee shops where people lingered over conversations instead of rushing through them, the slower rhythm of a world that prioritized connection over conquest. At Miles Technologies, the emergency he had created by canceling his meetings had been efficiently managed by his team. The Henderson acquisition was proceeding on schedule, the Singapore contracts were being reviewed by legal, and the board presentation had been rescheduled for the following week. The company, it turned out, could function perfectly well without his constant oversight. Jennifer knocked on his door around noon, looking cautiously optimistic. "How did it go with your daughters this morning?" Garrett asked before she could launch into the day's urgent matters. "Oh," she seemed surprised that he remembered. "It was nice, actually. Sarah had made me a drawing of our family, and Emma told me all about the book they're reading in class. I hadn't realized how much I was missing by rushing out so early. Maybe you should do it more often." "Sir?" "Take them to school. Be there for the small things. The company won't collapse if you start at 9 instead of 7. Jennifer stared at him as if he had suggested she come to work in a clown costume. "Mr. Miles, are you feeling all right?" Garrett laughed, actually laughed. something that happened so rarely in this office that it seemed to surprise them both. "No," he said, "I don't think I am, but maybe that's the first step toward feeling better." Dr. Sarah Martinez's office was nothing like Garrett had expected. Instead of the sterile professionalism he associated with business meetings, the space felt warm, soft lighting, comfortable chairs arranged at angles that invited conversation rather than confrontation, and bookshelves lined with titles that suggested someone who thought deeply about the human condition. Dr. Martinez herself was younger than he had imagined, maybe early 40s, with silver threading through her dark hair and the kind of steady presence that made you want to tell the truth. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Garrett said, settling into the chair across from her. "Of course. On the phone, you mentioned this was urgent." Garrett looked out the window at the afternoon traffic, people heading home to families and dinners and bedtime stories. "I think I've been living the wrong life," he said simply. "Dr. Preberford." Martinez leaned forward slightly, her expression attentive but not judgmental. "Tell me what you mean by that." So Garrett told her. About the night in the break room, about Carmen and Miguel, about realizing he didn't know what stories his own son liked, about the hollow success and the way love looked when it was practiced instead of performed. "It sounds like you had what we call a moment of clarity," Dr. Martinez said when he finished. "Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to help us see what we've been missing in our own lives." "But how did I miss it? How did I become someone who works instead of lives?" That's a question that probably has layers of answers. "Tell me about your childhood." Garrett found himself talking about things he hadn't thought about in years. His mother working multiple jobs, the cramped apartment where silence meant unpaid bills, the way poverty felt like a constant emergency that required constant vigilance. How success, when it finally came, felt like armor against ever being vulnerable again. "It sounds like you learned early that security came from work, from achievement," Dr. Martinez observed. "That love was something that could be lost if you weren't careful, but success was something you could control." "Maybe. But I had Elena. I had Ethan. I had love, and I traded it for." Garrett gestured vaguely. "For what? More money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes? A building with my name on it? What do you think you were really trading it for?" The question sat in the air between them. Garrett considered the easy answers security, stability, the ability to provide. But underneath those reasonable explanations was something rawer, more frightening. "Control," he said finally. "I was trading love for the illusion that I could control everything. That if I worked hard enough, built enough, accumulated enough, nothing bad could ever happen to us." "And how did that work out?" Garrett laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I lost my family anyway. I just lost it slowly, one missed dinner at a time." Martinez was quiet for a moment, letting the admission settle. "Garrett, do you think it's possible to build a different kind of success? One that includes the people you love instead of sacrificing them?" "I don't know. I've spent so many years believing that caring about people made you weak, that emotions were liabilities in business. How do you unlearn something that fundamental?" "The same way you learned it in the first place. One choice at a time, one day at a time. You took Ethan to school today, that was a choice. You're here talking to me instead of in a meeting, that's another choice. But what if it's too late? What if I've already done too much damage? Is that what you really believe? Or is that what you're afraid might be true?" The distinction hit him like a revelation. Fear. That's what this was. Underneath all the regret and self-recrimination. Fear that he had become someone unworthy of love, that his son would grow up seeing him as a stranger who paid the bills, rather than a father who cared about dinosaurs and field trips and bedtime stories. "I'm terrified," Garrett admitted. "I don't know how to be a father. I mean, I know how to provide and protect and plan for the future, but I don't know how to just be present. How to love someone without trying to fix everything for them. Those are skills you can learn, but it starts with showing up, which you've already begun to do." When Garrett left Dr. Martinez's office an hour later, he felt simultaneously drained and energized. The conversation had cracked something open in his chest, not the clean break of sudden insight, but the messier work of excavating years of accumulated defenses. He drove back to the office, but instead of going to his floor, he found himself riding the elevator down to the 32nd floor. Carmen would be starting her shift soon, and there was something he needed to say. He found her in the supply room, methodically organizing cleaning materials with the same quiet efficiency he had noticed before. She looked up in surprise when he knocked on the doorframe. "Mr. Miles, I didn't expect to see you. I wanted to thank you," he said, "for last night, for letting me see." He trailed off, not sure how to explain what she had shown him without sounding patronizing or dramatic. Carmen set down the spray bottle she had been organizing and studied his face with that same gentle attention she had given him in the break. "Two-room. You look different," she said simply. "I feel different. I took my son to school this morning. First time in. I don't even remember how long." A small smile played at the corners of Carmen's mouth. "How was it?" "Good. Hard. He wants me to take him again tomorrow." "And will you?" "Yes." The certainty in his own voice surprised him. "I'm going to try to do a lot of things differently." Carmen nodded, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "Change is hard work," she said. "Harder than most people think. But you seem like someone who knows how to work hard." "I've been working hard at the wrong things." "Maybe. Or maybe you just needed to learn what the right things were." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, surrounded by the humble tools of Carmen's trade mops and brushes and bottles of cleaner that somehow seemed more honest than the contracts and projections that filled Garrett's world. "Carmen," Garrett said finally, "would you and Miguel like to have dinner with me and Ethan sometime? I mean, if that's not inappropriate, I just thought." "Miguel seems like he might enjoy meeting another kid who likes stories." Carmen's expression softened. "I think Miguel would like that very much. And his mother Touche works so many hours, she doesn't get many chances to see him make new friends." "What about Saturday? There's a pizza place near Ethan's school. Nothing fancy, just family," Carmen finished gently. "Yes, just family." After Carmen returned to her work, Garrett went back to his office, but he found himself looking at the familiar space with new eyes. The awards and accolades that lined his walls, the expensive furniture, the view that cost more per square foot than most people's homesit, all felt like elaborate set dressing for a play he no longer wanted to perform. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to his senior staff, outlining a new policy: no meetings before 9 a.m. or after 6 p.m., mandatory lunch breaks, and encouragement for employees with children to attend school events without penalty to their career advancement. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was a start. His phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Ethan came home talking about your drive to school. He wants to know if you can help him practice his presentation about dinosaurs." Garrett stared at the message for a long moment, then called her instead of texting back. "Elena, it's me." "Yes, I'd love to help with the presentation. What time works?" "No, I can move the conference call." "This is more important." The words felt strange in his mouth, but also right. More important. When was the last time he had said that about anything that wasn't related to revenue or market share? "Garrett," Elena said, and her voice was carefully neutral, "I don't want you to feel like you have to prove anything dramatic. Ethan just wants his dad to care about the things he cares about." "I know. I want to care about them too. I want to learn how." There was a pause, and Garrett could almost hear Elena processing this conversation, trying to decide whether to trust this version of him. "Okay," she said finally. "Come by around 7. He'll have finished his homework by then." "I'll be there." "Garrett?" "Yeah?" "Don't make promises you can't keep." Not to him. The warning was gentle but firm, and Garrett understood the weight behind it. This wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. This was about showing up, consistently and imperfectly, for the small moments that actually comprised a life. "I understand," he said. "I'll see you at 7. Garrett spent the rest of the afternoon clearing his schedule for the next few days, rearranging meetings and delegating responsibilities with an efficiency that surprised even him. For years, he had operated under the assumption that the company would collapse without his constant oversight. Now, faced with the prospect of being present for his son's life, he discovered that most of what consumed his time was habit rather than necessity. At 6:30, he left the office. Walking through the lobby, he passed the security desk where the evening shift was beginning. Carmen waved from across the lobby, a small gesture that felt like blessing. The drive to Elena's house was familiar now, but tonight it carried different weight. Tonight, he wasn't rushing to assuage guilt or perform fatherhood for an audience of his own conscience. Tonight, he was simply going to spend time with his son because he wanted to know what dinosaurs Ethan found most fascinating, and why. Ethan met him at the door, his face bright with excitement, and a poster board covered in carefully drawn pictures of various prehistoric creatures. "Dad, look what I made! This is a stegosaurus, and this is a brachiosaurus, and this one is a velociraptor, which is actually way smaller than in the movies but super smart, and they hunted in packs like wolves." Garrett knelt down to examine the poster, really looking at his son's careful artwork, the hours of research evident in the detailed descriptions written in Ethan's careful second-grade handwriting. "This is incredible, buddy. Tell me about this one, the one with the long neck." And Ethan did. For the next 2 hours, Garrett learned more about paleontology than he had ever imagined he would know, but more importantly, he learned about his son's capacity for wonder, his methodical approach to understanding the world, his gentle fascination with creatures that existed millions of years before humans ever dreamed of building empires. When it was time for Ethan's bath and bedtime routine, Garrett found himself lingering, not wanting the evening to end. "Dad," Ethan said as Elena called from upstairs that his bath was ready, "will you read me a story tonight?" The request was casual, matter-of-fact, as if his father had been reading him bedtime stories all along instead of missing them for months. The trust in Ethan's voice, his simple assumption that his dad would want to participate in this daily ritual, nearly undid Garrett completely. "I'd love to," he managed. "Great. I have a new book about a dragon who collects stories instead of treasure. I think you'll like it. A dragon who collected stories." Garrett smiled despite the tightness in his throat. "I think I will too." 3 weeks later, Garrett sat in a different kind of boardroom. The pizza place near Ethan's school was nothing like the polished conference rooms where he usually conducted business. Red vinyl booths, checkered tablecloths, the cheerful chaos of families sharing mealsit was exactly the kind of place he would have dismissed as beneath his attention just a month ago. Now, watching Ethan and Miguel bent over a shared drawing of what appeared to be a dinosaur riding a rocket ship, Garrett couldn't imagine anywhere he'd rather be. "They're good together," Sophia said, smiling as she watched her son explain something complicated about space travel to his new friend. In street clothes instead of her hospital scrubs, she looked younger than Garrett had initially thought, probably only a few years older than Elena. "Ethan's been talking about Miguel all week," Elena said. "I think he's excited to have a friend who knows as much about books as he does about science." Carmen, sitting across from Garrett, was quietly watching the interaction between the boys with the satisfied expression of someone who had orchestrated something good. She had traded her custodial uniform for a simple dress that made her look less like an employee and more like what she had always been, a grandmother who loved stories and understood children. "Miguel has been asking when he gets to see Mr. Ethan's dad again," she said. "He was very impressed by your office view." "It's just Garrett," he said, "please. And I was thinking Miguel mentioned he likes to read about space. There's a planetarium downtown that does shows for kids. Maybe we could all go sometime?" The suggestion came out more tentatively than he had intended. This was new territory for him, navigating the delicate social architecture of friendship across class lines, trying to extend generosity without condescension. Sophia's expression grew careful. "That's very kind, but—" "Mom," Miguel interrupted, looking up from his drawing, "a planetarium is like a big movie theater, but for stars. Can we please go?" "It's just an idea," Garrett said quickly. "No pressure. I just thought, we'd love to, Carmen said firmly, giving her daughter a look that carried decades of motherly authority. Wouldn't we, Sophia? Sophia hesitated for another moment, then nodded. Miguel would love that. Thank you. The conversation moved on to other things, school and work, and the small daily negotiations of life, but Garrett found himself studying this impromptu family that had somehow formed around a shared pizza. Carmen and Sophia switching effortlessly between English and Spanish, the boys collaborating on increasingly elaborate drawings, Elena looking more relaxed than he had seen her in years. When had he last sat at a table like this, surrounded by conversation that had nothing to do with profit margins or market penetration? When had he last felt like part of something instead of the person everyone else was performing for? Dad? Ethan said, sliding over to show him the latest addition to their artistic collaboration. Miguel says his abuela knows stories about dragons that are real. Like they used to live in Mexico and protect villages and stuff. Not real, Miguel clarified seriously, but real in the stories. My abuela says that's just as important. Garrett looked at Carmen, who smiled. Stories carry truth even when they're not facts, she said. Sometimes, especially then. Will you tell us one? Ethan asked. A dragon story? Carmen glanced around the table, checking for permission from the adults. Elena nodded encouragingly. Sophia smiled, and Garrett found himself leaning forward with the same anticipation he saw in the children's faces. Well, Carmen began, her voice taking on the cadence Garrett remembered from that night in the break room. There once was a dragon who lived in the mountains above a small village. But this dragon was different from the ones in most stories. As Carmen wove her tale about a dragon who had forgotten how to fly because he spent all his time counting his treasure, and a little girl who reminded him that gold was only valuable if it could buy happiness, Garrett found himself transported. Not just by the story itself, but by the magic of shared attention, the way everyone at the table leaned in, the children's eyes wide with wonder, the adults smiling at familiar rhythms. This was what he had missed, he realized. Not just the bedtime stories with Ethan, but the deeper rhythm of community, of belonging to something larger than his own ambition. When Carmen finished, Miguel clapped enthusiastically. Tell the one about the coyote and the stars. Another time, Maijo, Carmen said gently. It's getting late, and tomorrow is a school day. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Sophia approached Garrett hesitantly. Thank you, she said quietly. For including us. Miguel doesn't. He doesn't get to do things like this very often. His father isn't around, and with my work schedule. Thank you for letting us be part of your family tonight, Garrett replied. I think Ethan needed this as much as Miguel did. Sophia smiled, the wariness in her expression finally relaxing completely. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone harder, I guess. More. She searched for the right word. More like I was a month ago, Garrett finished. Maybe. But people don't usually change that much, that fast. Garrett glanced over at Carmen, who was helping the boys clean up their art supplies with patient efficiency. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they just need the right teacher. The drive home was quiet, Ethan drowsy in the back seat, Elena unusually thoughtful beside him. They had fallen into this routine over the past 3 weeks. Family dinners twice a week, bedtime stories when Garrett's schedule allowed, small daily check-ins that felt less like obligation and more like genuine connection. He's different, Elena said finally, as they pulled into her driveway. Who? You, with Carmen and Sophia and Miguel tonight. You weren't performing being generous or trying to impress anyone. You were just present. Garrett considered this as he helped carry a sleepy Ethan inside. Present. Such a simple word for something that had felt impossible just weeks ago. After Ethan was tucked into bed and Garrett had read him a story about a bear who learned to share his cave with other woodland creatures, Elena walked him to the door. Garrett? She said, and there was something different in her voice. Dr. Martinez called me yesterday. Garrett paused, his hand on the doorknob. She did? She asked if I'd be willing to come in for a session. With you. She said you'd been making good progress, but that there were things that might be helpful to work through together. The prospect of sitting in that warm office with Elena, excavating the ruins of their marriage under professional supervision, should have terrified him. A month ago, it would have. Now, it felt like another necessary step toward becoming someone worthy of the love he had been offered. What did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it. Elena leaned against the doorframe, studying his face in the porch light. Garrett, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing this because I think we can fix what we broke. I'm doing this because Ethan deserves parents who can work together, who can be in the same room without all the old anger and disappointment. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't about winning me back or proving you've changed. This is about learning how to be better co-parents. How to both love him without competing over who loves him more. The distinction was important, and Garrett felt the weight of it. This wasn't about romantic reconciliation or dramatic second chances. This was about the harder, less cinematic work of building functional relationship from the wreckage of a dysfunctional one. Elena, he said carefully, I know I can't undo the damage I did to us, but I want to learn how to be the kind of person who doesn't keep making the same mistakes. Not just for Ethan, but because I don't want to be that person anymore. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. Okay, she said finally. I'll call Dr. Martinez tomorrow. Driving home to his empty downtown condo, Garrett found himself thinking about the dragon in Carmen's story, the one who had forgotten how to fly because he was so focused on counting his treasure. The parallel wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Sometimes the most important truths were simple ones. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Miles, this is Sophia. Thank you again for tonight. Miguel can't stop talking about the rocket dinosaur he and Ethan invented. Looking forward to the planetarium, Garrett smiled, typing back. Thank you for trusting us with your evening. Same time next week? The response came quickly. We'll be there. At his apartment, Garrett made himself a simple dinner and ate it at his Kit Miles table, instead of standing over the sink or eating at his desk while reviewing reports. Such a small change, but it felt revolutionary, the act of sitting down, of making space for the basic ritual of nourishment. His condo, which had always felt sleek and efficient, now seemed almost aggressively minimalist. Where were the family photos, the children's artwork, the accumulated detritus of a life lived with other people? When had he started equating emptiness with sophistication? Garrett found himself at his laptop, not reviewing quarterly projections or international market reports, but researching child-friendly restaurants for next week's dinner, looking up planetarium showtimes, reading about how to support children's interests in science and storytelling. Tomorrow, he would take Ethan to school again. They would talk about dinosaurs or dragons or whatever captured his son's imagination. Tomorrow evening, he would read another bedtime story, learning the rhythm of Ethan's preferences, the way his son's mind worked through narrative and wonder. And next week, he would sit in Dr. Martinez's office with Elena, doing the hard work of untangling years of accumulated hurt and assumption, not to rebuild what they had broken, but to construct something new, a partnership focused on raising their son rather than on their own unresolved pain. It wasn't the life Garrett had planned when he started building his empire. It was smaller in some ways, more constrained by other people's needs and schedules. But it was also richer, more connected to the things that actually mattered. He thought of Carmen's story about the dragon who had to choose between his treasure and his ability to fly. Garrett was still learning how to let go of the gold, still figuring out how to remember that wings were more valuable than wealth. But for the first time in years, he was beginning to remember what it felt like to be airborne. End of Part 4, ready for Part 5. Part 5, 2 months later, Garrett found himself in a place he had never expected to be. The emergency room at Children's Hospital, holding Elena's hand while they waited for news about Ethan. The call had come during a board meeting, Elena's voice tight with controlled panic, explaining that Ethan had fallen from the jungle gym at school, that there might be a concussion, that she was following the ambulance, and could Garrett please come. Garrett had left the meeting without explanation, his assistant scrambling to reschedule millions of dollars worth of negotiations while he drove through downtown traffic with the kind of focused desperation he had never felt about any business crisis. Now, sitting in the harsh, fluorescent light of the waiting room, he understood something about love that all his success had never taught him, that caring about someone meant living with the constant possibility of losing them, and that this vulnerability was not weakness but the price of everything that mattered. "He's going to be okay," Elena said, though her voice carried the tremor of someone trying to convince herself as much as him. The doctor said the CT scan looked good, just a mild concussion and some bruises. "He's going to be okay," Garrett repeated, squeezing her hand. They had been doing this, supporting each other through the ordinary crises of parenthood more naturally over the past few weeks. The joint therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez had been harder than Garrett expected, requiring him to sit with Elena's anger and disappointment without defending himself, to acknowledge the ways his absence had shaped not just their marriage, but Ethan's understanding of what fathers were supposed to be. But there had been progress, too. Tentative at first, then more confident, the development of what Dr. Martinez called functional co-parenting. Built on mutual respect rather than romantic love, focused on Ethan's well-being rather than their own unresolved hurt. "Mr. and Mrs. Miles?" They both looked up at the doctor, a young woman with kind eyes and the calm competence that came from delivering news to worried parents. "Ethan is awake and asking for both of you. The concussion is mild, and we want to keep him for observation tonight, but he should be able to go home tomorrow." The relief was physical. Garrett felt his shoulders drop, his breathing steady, the tight knot in his chest finally loosening. "Can we see him?" Elena asked. "Of course. But he's pretty drowsy from the pain medication, so don't be alarmed if he seems a little confused." They found Ethan in a pediatric room, decorated with cheerful murals of cartoon animals. He looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, a bandage covering a scrape on his forehead, but his eyes were alert and he smiled when he saw them. "Mom! Dad! Did you know that when you hit your head really hard, sometimes your brain gets shaken up like jelly in a jar?" Even injured, their son was collecting information, turning trauma into learning. Garrett had to bite back a laugh that was half relief, half recognition of this essential Ethanness that no amount of medical equipment could diminish. "That's right, buddy," Garrett said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, and my head hurts a little. But the nurse said I was very brave when they took pictures of my brain." Ethan's voice was slightly slurred from the medication but proud. "She showed me the X-ray. You can see the inside of my skull." Elena laughed despite her worry. "Only you would find a concussion educational." "Mom, can you call Miguel and tell him what happened? He's going to want to know about the brain pictures." The request was so normal, so connected to the life Ethan had built over the past 2 months, friendships and curiosity, and the assumption that the people he loved would want to share in his experience, that Garrett felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'll call Carmen," Elena said. "She can tell Miguel and Sophia." "And Dad?" Ethan turned to Garrett with the serious expression he wore when discussing important matters. "You don't have to stay all night. I know you have work stuff." The casual acceptance in Ethan's voice, his assumption that work would naturally take precedence over a hospitalized child, hit Garrett like a physical blow. This was how his son saw him, even after 2 months of daily phone calls and bedtime stories and Saturday morning dinosaur research. Still the father who might leave when business called. "Buddy," Garrett said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest, "there is nowhere else I would rather be tonight than right here with you." Ethan blinked, processing this information with the careful attention he brought to all new data. "Really? Really? Work can wait. You're more important." A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, made lopsided by the medication but radiant with joy. "Okay. Can you tell me a story? The one Carmen told us about the dragon who forgot how to fly." "I can try, but your abuela Carmen tells it better than I do." "That's okay. I like the way you tell stories too." So Garrett told the story, adapting it as he went, letting it become something new in the telling. Elena curled up in the other chair, listening with the same attention Ethan gave to his favorite tales, and gradually the sterile hospital room began to feel less like a place of crisis and more like a place where a family was taking care of each other. When Ethan finally fell asleep, his small hand still holding Garrett's, Elena looked across the narrow space between their chairs. "You meant it," she said quietly. "About staying." "Of course I meant it. 6 months ago, you would have delegated this to me. You would have found a way to make the hospital vigil my responsibility while you handled the important crisis at work." Garrett wanted to argue, to defend his past self, but the truth was stark and undeniable. 6 months ago, he would have seen Elena's presence as sufficient, would have convinced himself that his absence was justified by the need to maintain the income that paid for their comfortable life. "I was wrong about so many things," he said simply. Elena was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the dim light from the hallway. "Do you remember when Ethan was born?" she asked. Garrett nodded. Those first days felt both impossibly distant and vividly immediate, the overwhelming responsibility of sudden parenthood, the way love and terror had combined into something that changed everything. You held him for hours that first night, just sat in the rocking chair and held him while he slept. I kept trying to get you to put him down, to get some rest, but you said you were afraid he might disappear if you stopped paying attention. The memory surfaced gradually, the weight of his newborn son, the fierce protectiveness that had surprised him with its intensity, the way fatherhood had felt like the most important job he would ever have. "What happened to that person?" Elena asked, but her voice carried curiosity rather than accusation. "I think he got scared," Garrett said slowly. "Scared that love wasn't enough to protect him, that providing wasn't enough to guarantee safety. So he started trying to control everything else, the money, the business, the future, instead of just being present for what was actually happening." "And now?" Garrett looked at Ethan's sleeping face, peaceful despite the bandages and medical equipment. "Now I think I'm learning that presence is the only real protection I can offer. That love is actually the only security that matters." Elena reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, not romantic but companionate, the gesture of two people who had created something together and were committed to protecting it. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, "for the work you've been doing, for being here, for learning how to be the father Ethan deserves." The words hit Garrett more powerfully than any business accolade or financial milestone ever had. To be seen by someone who knew him at his worst, to be acknowledged for becoming better at, felt like the only success that mattered. They spent the night taking turns dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chairs, checking on Ethan whenever he stirred, murmuring reassurances when he woke confused by the unfamiliar surroundings. It was exhausting and uncomfortable and exactly where Garrett wanted to be. In the early morning, when the first nurses began their rounds and Ethan was cleared to go home, Garrett realized something had shifted permanently, not just in his relationship with his son, but in his understanding of what constituted a life worth living. Carmen arrived, just as they were preparing to leave, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and a new book about brave dinosaurs who took care of their friends. "Miguel insisted I bring this," she said, presenting the book to Ethan. "He said injured heroes need new stories to help them heal." "Tell Miguel I'll call him later," Ethan said, carefully examining his gift. "I want to tell him about the brain pictures and ask if he knows any stories about hospitals." "I will? And Ethan?" Carmen's voice carried the gentle authority that Garrett had come to recognize as one of her greatest gifts. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let the people who love us take care of us. You did that yesterday." As they walked toward the elevator, Garrett carrying Ethan's overnight bag while Elena helped their son navigate the hallway with careful steps, Carmen fell into step beside him. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for becoming the kind of man who stays." The observation was simple, without fanfare, but it carried the weight of witness. Carmen had seen him change, had been present for the transformation from someone who performed fatherhood to someone who lived it. "Thank you," Garrett replied, "for showing me what that looked like." In the parking garage, as they prepared to drive home to a quiet day of recovery and storytelling, Elena turned to Garrett with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I was thinking about how you'll probably get calls today. About the board meeting you walked out of, about whatever crisis emerged while you were here with us." Garrett nodded. There would be calls, urgent emails, people who needed decisions that only he could make. The business world didn't pause for personal emergencies, even ones involving hospitalized children. "And I was thinking," Elena continued, "about how you'll handle those calls, whether you'll slip back into believing that everything depends on you, that the company will collapse if you don't rush back to put out every fire." It was a fair question, an acknowledgement of the pattern that had defined their marriage. Garrett's good intentions overwhelmed by his sense of indispensable urgency. "I'm going to tell them I'll be back tomorrow," Garrett said, "that today I'm taking care of my son. And if they say it can't wait?" Garrett looked at Ethan, who was contentedly reading his new book in the back seat, and realized the answer was easier than he had expected. "Then they'll learn to wait," he said, "or they'll learn to solve problems without me. Either way, they'll be fine." Elena smiled, not the careful, guarded expression she had worn for months, but something warmer, more hopeful. "Good," she said. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." As Garrett drove them home through the morning traffic, listening to Ethan read aloud from his dinosaur book, he understood that this was what recovery looked like, not dramatic transformation, but the accumulation of small choices, daily decisions to show up for what mattered most. The calls would come, and he would handle them. The business would present new crises, and he would address them. But tonight, he would read bedtime stories. Tomorrow, he would take Ethan to school. Next weekend, they would go to the planetarium with Carmen and Miguel and Sophia, and he would learn something new about the wonder his son found in the world. It wasn't the life he had planned when he started building his empire, but it was richer than any success he had previously imagined, more valuable than any treasure he had accumulated. And for the first time in years, Garrett Miles felt like he was exactly where he belonged.